Everyone, in this video, I want to talk about why you should use Cortex or realistically any system like Cortex for your historical data. If you're moving from Cherwell to another platform, or as I've mentioned in previous videos, if you're moving from ServiceNow to another platform, or even from ServiceNow to ServiceNow, doing a replatforming or back-to-box project, why you should use something like Cortex for all of that archival data. But before we get into it, I want to remind you that every week at 10 a.m. Pacific time on Tuesday, we host the Cortex users group. This is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have about Cortex, talk to people who are also using Cortex or looking into using Cortex, um, and get help with some of the common configuration questions and issues that you might run into as you get onboarded into Cortex. It's also an opportunity for us to share some of the things that we're looking at adding to Cortex and some of the new features that we're trying out. And you can give feedback directly to us and talk to us and it's a discussion, right? It's a discussion with your peers, with us, and it's something that we really enjoy doing because community is at the heart of how we're building out this whole Cortex thing. You can find a link down in the description below to get an invite to the Cortex users group. You can also find a link down in the description below to our idea site. So if you can't make it to the Cortex users group but do have an idea for a feature or something, you can add it to that site and we'll add it to an upcoming release. So with that, let's talk about why you should use something like Cortex and kind of where it sits in the kind of tapestry of data migration and moving from a system like Cherwell to whatever the new system is, whether it's Halo, ServiceNow, Easy Vista, Symphony AI, any one of those tools. We've got lots of people who are moving from Cherwell to basically any of those tools. Regardless of the tool that you're moving to, the question comes up, what am I going to do with all of this data that I've had in Cherwell for a while, right? So right off the bat, we want to set some kind of assumptions. We assume that you're going to want a copy of your data. You're actually entitled to a copy of your data from Avanti. So my recommendation, whether you use Cortex or do something totally different, is that you should absolutely get a copy of your data from Avanti. There's a specific process to get a copy of your Cherwell database, and I'll leave that linked in the description below as well. Um, you're entitled to it by contract. So regardless of what you do, you should absolutely get a copy of your data. This is as a SQL, a Microsoft SQL Server backup, which you can then restore to a Microsoft SQL Server in a location of your choosing, and then you have access to all of the data, right? You can, if you want to, write SQL queries against it. You can use a BI tool like Power BI, Tableau, those sorts of things. We'll talk about those a little bit later in the video. Or, of course, you can use something like Cortex. Um, the other thing we assume is that you'll probably want to import some portion of that data into your new system. Maybe things like knowledge articles, certainly things like open incidents that you're still in the process of working, right? It doesn't make sense necessarily to keep all of your open incidents in the old system, though some organizations do run two systems in parallel, so they kind of close the open incidents as many as they can in the old system as they're transitioning to the new system, so new tickets would get opened in the new system. But even with that, we find that typically there are some percentage of those open incidents that just can't be closed in the old system by the time it's the deadline hits and it's time to move over to the new system. So you'll probably be importing some number of open incidents from Cherwell into your new system just to ensure that operational continuity. But what about all that other data, right? All of the closed incidents, all of the changes that have happened in the past. Maybe you've been using Cherwell for years and years and years, over a decade. And so you have 10 years of data that you need to do something with. Well, this is where something like Cortex really shines. And we think Obviously, we're biased, but we think that Cortex is the best tool out there. Um, and like I said, we'll talk about Power BI and Tableau and other BI tools in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about why we don't recommend that you import everything. You know, since you're already going to be importing some things into your new system, why not just take everything? Take all of the historical incidents, take all of the historical changes, take all of the knowledge articles. I mean, maybe you do take all of the knowledge articles because your knowledge base is still relevant. Even if it was written a long time ago, some of those articles might still be relevant. But there are a few different reasons why we don't recommend that you just import everything wholesale. The first reason is that every system is different. Every ITSM platform has a different way of organizing incidents, the supporting records, especially attachments. And when you try to import the historical data from Cherwell, especially into another system, you end up doing one of two things. Either you're shoehorning the old data into the new format, which means that all of the old data no longer looks the same way that it did in the old system, or you're configuring the new system to behave or at least be organized like, in this case, Cherwell, which means that you don't necessarily take advantage of all of the new features and functionality. You're not thinking in terms of the future vision, or you can potentially become trapped with some of the decisions, some of the architectural decisions, the organizational decisions that you were forced into when you built out Cherwell. You know, your business has evolved since then, so why not take this as an opportunity to figure out what the your IT process of the now and the future will look like. Next, the data isn't in a familiar format the minute you massage it, the minute you change it into that new format. Um, and that can be a challenge for audits or for legal requirements to prove that it was the same data that you were looking at in Cherwell that you're now seeing in the new system. And if that's something that's important to you, that's definitely something that should be at the top of your list of requirements, is making sure that you can guarantee that the data that you're looking for and that you need to provide for audits or something like that is in fact the same data that came from Cherwell, and ideally looks the same way, because Cherwell uh, had a lot of expressions, a lot of the forms, in addition to just having the form fields, which showed the values directly from the database. A lot of the labels were expression based, so not necessarily directly correlating to a specific field in the database. And if that's something that's important that decisions were made based off of, you probably want to be able to see that in as similar a way as it was in Cherwell. Um, and that's what Cortex provides. So I'll mention that again a little bit later in the video. Now, in either of these situations, basically what ends up happening is that you're finding a compromise between the the benefits of the new system and the data integrity of the old system. And ideally, we'd like to find a situation where you can have perfect data integrity of the old data, but also be able to take advantage of the capabilities of the new system, and that's what Cortex provides. So our recommendation is that you import only what's necessary to continue day-to-day operations, and keep the historical data in a system like Cortex, or at least in that SQL backup. The benefits, obviously, you get to the opportunity to build out a new system based on your current and future needs, and potentially some of the new features that the new system provides, or that the fact that it's 2025 provides, right? AI is something that's new and very much on top of everyone's mind, and that's something that really wasn't very present in Cherwell, and probably not very visible from your data perspective, especially if you started on Cherwell back several years ago. And with what we're proposing here, you can always get back to the old data without having to worry about how or if it was imported, or if it was imported successfully, or if all of the data came across, or what it's going to look like in the new system. You can always get back to it and see it exactly the way that you expected to see it. And perhaps most importantly, you have support for this archival solution from a team that's focused specifically on doing that, right? If you migrate all of your data into a new system, that's part of a project. And once the data is imported, that's it. The data is imported. Um, or if you just restore it to a SQL database, once the database is restored, it's there, and that's kind of the end of the line for the support. If you actually have a system placed around it, whether it's Cortex or another option, you can build the support structure around it to make sure that a team, is focused on making sure that the data is always valid, making sure that the data always shows up the way it's supposed to, and that's something that we provide, of course, with our subscription support plans. Now, I mentioned BI tools a couple times so far in this video. So why can't you just use a BI tool like Power BI or Tableau? Um, and now you certainly could. Obviously, the data is in the database. There's nothing stopping you from attaching a BI tool to the database and then being able to run reports against it or search for records or that sort of thing. But BI tools really weren't designed for this archival situation, and that means that they don't provide quite the experience that you're probably looking for from an archival solution. They're designed for reporting, which I think of as like aggregating over data, right? So like how many incidents occurred over a particular time frame, how many incidents were closed within SLA, how many were breached, that sort of thing. That's where BI tools really shine, is that serious data crunching perspective, but they're not really designed for record by record data access. So find me this particular record with this incident ID. Um, sure, you can use them for that, but that's not really what they're designed for. So building that out and trying to use that and visualize that tends to be clunky and time consuming, especially when you're dealing with an audit and there's a time crunch and that sort of thing. Now, I already mentioned that those reports don't look like the Cherwell business object forms, and that may or may not be important to you specifically, but having the familiarity of those business object forms and actually being able to see the data the same way that you saw it in Cherwell might add that additional level of comfort that the data that you're looking at is in fact the data that you were working off of when you were using Cherwell. Again, that might be something that's important to you, that might not, but at the very least, there's an additional guarantee that what you're looking at in Cortex is the same thing that you would have been looking at in Cherwell. So we think that's important. And that's one of the reasons that we've uh, made a concerted effort to make Cortex look as similar to Cherwell, you know, almost down to the pixel as we possibly could. Now, another thing that you might not think about when you're using a BI tool is how the data is related to each other. In Cherwell, that just kind of works, right? You have a form with a form arrangement, and the related data just appears, and you don't really have to worry about it. But behind the scenes, Cherwell's relationships can be really, really complex. It's not just as simple as, a join between tables. Some of them are, but not always. And trying to model that correctly in BI tools can be a chore and can be challenging. And that's not something that you want to be doing again while you're dealing with the deadline of an upcoming audit, trying to make sure that all of your relationships are lining up correctly. So with Cortex, we've already done the work. We know that we're interpreting the relationships properly, regardless of what business objects you're using. And we can guarantee that the records that are coming back as part of that relationship are the records that are actually part of that relationship from Cherwell. And finally, attachments. The way Cherwell stores attachments is they are encoded in the database. BI tools don't really do any of that. They don't really care about attachments stored in their database. So getting access to those attachments, if your BI tool even supports that, would be very tricky, and it would be quite the challenge. Um, Now, all of this, hopefully, by this point, you've recognized that using a solution other than Cortex is it's going to be a challenge. So, how does Cortex specifically solve all of this? Because we don't want to just leave you with, well, there is no hope. There absolutely is hope. Cortex is the answer. Again, we might be biased, but we've specifically designed Cortex to work for this situation in a few different ways. So the first one is that Cortex operates on the same SQL database that Cherwell did. We actually have a few infrastructures where we've installed Cherwell, created a Cherwell database in SQL Server, and then we run Cortex on that same database. Now, I don't recommend that for your case, but that is a situation that works technically. And that is 100% to ensure that we are operating on the same data that Cherwell creates. We didn't want to create an additional migration or an additional, ETL process to force your data into another format, right? If we were going to do that, why not just convert all of your data into the format for your new ITSM tool? So we operate on the exact same database structure, and we interpret all of the information directly from the Cherwell database to show you your forms, your grids, exactly the way you saw them in Cherwell. Now, that's the second point, is that we show you the grids and forms that you designed in Cherwell. So we didn't want you to have to go through an additional configuration process of how do you want to see this data. We assume that you want to see this data the same way you did in Cherwell. So we made that happen. This means that you're always looking at exactly the same records and exactly the same UI elements that you would have been looking at in Cherwell. So it's very familiar, and it should be immediately obvious that if you're looking at a particular record, it's the record that you meant to be looking for. Now, I also mentioned relationships and attachments. Cortex reads both of those directly from the database to ensure that the record that you're looking at and the related items, the form arrangement, all of the attachments are, in fact, all of the related that you would have been looking at in Cherwell. There's a common theme here. We're going to the database and letting the database tell us exactly what we should be showing you. So, however you have your system configured, that's the way Cortex is going to be presenting the data to you. You don't have to write a single SQL query. You don't have to do a single checkbox or button of configuration. Cortex looks at your database and shows you exactly what you would have been seeing in Cherwell. And if you're still running Cherwell, exactly what you're seeing today. And Cortex does all the heavy lifting. We spent a lot of time making sure that Cortex interprets your configuration exactly the way it was meant to be interpreted. And this is not just recent databases, not just 2023.1, 2023.3, not even 9.7, 10.1. We go all the way back to 8.1, I think is the oldest database we've actively tested. But because of the amount of testing we've done on all of those databases, we're sure that we can handle even older databases than that. I actually have a 4.6 database that I've been putting off testing Cortex on, but I'm sure I will be pleasantly surprised at how well Cortex handles the configuration in that database. So, regardless of what version you're on, both platform and content, and regardless of what version you started with, we're sure that Cortex will be able to handle your data most of the way. And if there's anything that we need to tweak to support your specific version or your specific configuration, we can do that in a matter of days, maybe weeks. Some of the configuration has been a little bit hard to track down, uh, but realistically, once we have an example of a piece of configuration that we're not yet addressing, it's super quick for us to account for it. And certainly within the next released version, and in some cases, we'll even create a patch version or an alpha or a beta version if we're not quite coming up to another release date. So we will make it happen. And then again, just to reiterate, the configuration side. there is no configuration aside from connecting Cortex to your database. All of the configuration you've done in Cherwell is already in your database. So that's where we go for the configuration. Once you tell Cortex how to talk to your database, Cortex takes over from there, handles the rest of it, and will show all of the business objects in your system, all of the forms in your system, all of the grids in your system, and we'll show it exactly the way that you expected to see it in Cherwell. This means that whatever you built and configured in Cherwell will show up in Cortex in exactly the same way. I feel like a lot of these I've repeated myself over and over again, but that's really the essence of how Cortex works. It's your database, the way it came from Cherwell. We read it, we interpret it, and we show you the data exactly the way that you saw it in Cherwell. So it couldn't be easier to handle your historical data. It almost makes it an afterthought. It's it means that your historical data is taken care of, and you can really focus the bulk, 99% of your time and effort on the transition from Cherwell to your new ITSM tool, focusing on how you're going to build out your new tool for the future, for your current needs, for your future needs, and how your help desk, how your other departments who are using Cherwell and going to use your new tool, how they can get their work done and not have to worry about any of the historical stuff. If you have any questions about any of this, you can, of course, leave a comment down below on the video. You can also schedule some time with me. There are links in the description below to book time on my calendar or to send me email. You can also go to our website, which is also linked down in the description below, to find out more information about Cortex and get in contact with us. Again, see a demo, schedule time with us to see Cortex on your own database. Uh, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We love talking to you all. That's one of the things we really enjoy is learning from all of you how you use Cherwell and all of the great things you did with Cherwell, and making sure that you are as successful with the new tool that you're going to as you were with Cherwell. So with that, I'm going to close this video by saying thank you. Thank you all. Cherwell had a great run. It's a bummer that Cherwell is going away, but we will certainly make sure that your data stays around and you have access to it exactly the way you need to have access to it. Thanks for watching, and like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.